Hello and welcome. We are with comrade Professor Bruno Drweski, and we will continue the subject of European Union. Yesterday I spoke with Bojan Stanislavski about conflict Poland with European Union. And today, Bruno will make a presentation, a short history of the Marxist analysis of the European Union. What is European Union? How it was created, and what
Yeah.
is
First of all, we have to take into account what quite little people know, that the European Union project is older than the European Union and the European economical community, which appeared at the end of the 50s. That this project is not a European project, but an American project that was launched during the Second World War by the Americans under one of their, now we know from archives, one of their agent, we could say one of their spies, Jean Monnet, one of the founder of the European Union. So that's the first thing we have to know. The Americans were in favor of European Union because they managed to create a common market that will be economically open to the United States, and that will be politically unable to function. That's the first thing. And we have about that quite a lot of documents, and we have to take into account that this project was step by step realized just after the Second World War, mostly around Western Germany, the future Federal Republic of Germany, which was the base of this creation. And it's, of course, for two reasons, because Germany was an occupied country and it was very easy to control out of Germany other European countries, because Germany, in spite of the fact that it was defeated, was a strong economy, a strong potential economy, because of its industry, because of the benefits German capitalists took from all of Europe during the Second World War, and because there were a lot of former Nazis who, after the Second World War, had no chance in politics if they would not collaborate with the winner, with the United States. And they were also very well trained, I would say, in fighting communism. So they were very positive for the reconstruction, or for the construction of a European alliance with the United States against Soviet Union and communists. And it's, of course, very important to know that Germany was a country where the communism was weak because of Nazism. And for the American, it was very positive because, as we know, at the end of the Second World War, communists were very strong, especially in Italy and France, other European countries which count, and that they have to take into account. Another reason why Germany was the base for the European Union project is also the fact that Germany was not a colonial power. And for the American, it was very important at the end of the Second World War to diminish colonialism, British and French colonialism, to take control of former French and British colonies. With Germans, they had not this problem. And that was another reason why Germany was the nucleus, I would say, Western Germany, of course, the base of the European Union project. Another reason why Germany was the base of this project was that German political tradition was a federal tradition, and they had the long history of the so-called Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which was the exact the exact example for the Americans of a structure they would like to see in Europe. Because if you go back to history, the German empire was so destructured that it never functioned as a political tool, but it created links, economical links between the different part of the former German empire. And this was exactly the aim of the American, to have a strong market, but without a strong political power, or at least without a strong democratic political power, let's say, but a strong bureaucracy which would work in favor of the market and of the capitalism. And that's the reason why we have, among people who were the founders of European Union, one was Jean Monnet, I told you about, which was who was an American spy from the very beginning of its career. The second one was Robert Schuman, which is half French, half German, but was at the end of the Second World War considered in France as a traitor because of his behavior at the beginning of the German occupation. And such a man was, of course, a good tool for Americans. But these two people were at least known. There is a third one who is less well known, is Hallstein. Hallstein was a German, he was a lawyer, and he was Hitler's lawyer concerning, during the Second World War, the project of the new European order. So he worked for Hitler during the Second World War for the so-called new European order on the legal aspect of the project. And after the Second World War, the American took him to work for the new European order, but not under Hitler, but under the American and later NATO influence. So we have to take that into account. Like we have to take into account that the so-called Marshall Plan, that is very often idealized according to, let's say, capitalist propaganda as the proof that the Americans are a good empire helping poor people to rebuild their destroyed Europe. This Marshall Plan is linked with the beginning of the European Union project, and its main aim was not to rebuild all Europe in, let's say, a democratical way, but to rebuild the strong capitalist and imperialist structures in Europe around Germany. And we have to take into account the fact that, for example, we have Western Germany was taking part, of course, in this Marshall Plan, like Portugal. But we know now, of course, it's very obvious that the Germans were really reinforced due to the Marshall Plan. Portugal stayed a poor country up to now. So the Marshall Plan was not an equal plan for every nation of Europe. It was a plan to rebuild the capacity, to help the reconstruction of the German productive capacities, so to make Germany back an imperialist power in the world, but especially in Europe, inside Europe, to balance the eventuality that France or Italy could develop in a rather independent way that would lead this country in the direction of socialism, which was, of course, very possible, because we have to take into account that at the end of the Second World War, in Italy, the communists had almost 40% of the vote, and in France, they had almost 30% of the vote. And the socialists at that time were quite hesitating between communists and right-wing parties. So logically, if we had no Cold War, we can say that the situation in Italy or France would evaluate in the direction of Czechoslovakia, where the communists had more or less also a little bit less than 30%, and they could transform Czechoslovakia in a socialist country. If Italy and France would be really democratic at the end of the Second World War, for sure the communists would have won, like they would have won in Greece, where they were in majority, and the situation in Europe would be completely different. And it was, of course, for the American much easier to rebuild, I would say, Europe, quote, rebuild Europe around West German imperialism. And that's the reason why the project of European Union was always based mostly on German imperialism, even if, of course, French imperialism and even Italian imperialism were admitted in this club, I would say, as cooperation with the American project. So that's something that we have that is very important to take into account. Second thing is, of course, that the creation of the European Union was not an easy thing to do because of the opposition, the strong opposition you had especially among left groups in Europe, among communists, but you had also in France, at least, a very skeptical attitude toward a unification of Europe under German authority among the Gaullists, which were the right wing, let's say, nationalists in France, which of course were quite strong at the end of the Second World War, and of course later when de Gaulle came back to power in France. So for the very beginning of the idea of unification, let's say, of Europe, you had two conceptions, very different conceptions. The one of an alliance of sovereign states, what called then was the Europe of nations, and the idea of a federal structure that would function more or less like the Federal Republic of Germany, and under German, but in fact under German-American leadership. Because, of course, German imperialism at the end of the Second World War was, I would say, was on the American agenda and was linked with American. I mean, the reconstruction of Western Germany was made by the Americans using former Nazis, especially former Nazis. And these people were very convenient for American imperialism, since they were delegitimized very easily. This American strategy you find everywhere. You find it in Germany, you find it in Italy, you find it in France, you find it in Japan, you find it in South Korea. In all those countries, and other countries like Greece also, the imperialists at the end of the Second World War used former Nazis, former fascists, to create the new, let's say, quote, the new state administration from the very beginning, because they were ideal tools of influence, since they were delegitimized by the anti-fascist movement. And that's the reason why the European Union is, to a large extent, a concept which renew with the idea of the fascist new European order, of the Hitler new European order, but of course under a more democratic appearance. And that's the reason why against this project you had, of course, the communists, but in France you had quite clearly, even if it was not said the same way, the Gaullists. And that's the reason why the construction of the European Union could not go very quickly, because this project was rather forced by the Vatican and, as I told you, the German imperialists, which were after the Second World War rebranded, I would say, from Nazism to Christian democracy. But basically, the Christian Democratic Party was a party where you found a lot of former Nazis. And this, of course, has to be taken into account. The same thing also is right for the Vatican, because the Catholic Church, and especially the Vatican, as we know, was one of the the ideological promoter of the European integration, under, of course, the ideals of Christianity, Catholicism, and so on. But in the same time, we know how the Vatican, after the Second World War, helped a lot of former Nazis to escape to Latin America, or to find their way in the new Italy or in the new Germany, especially. Even in France, the American, because we had, of course, American occupying troops, they managed to protect quite a lot of former French collaborators of Nazis, that they pushed, I would say, between communists and Gaullists, which were, of course, much more patriotically oriented. But the American forces at the end of the war had a lot of support among former Nazi collaborators in France. And we have all to take all that into account. And the project of European Union, which was not officially called like that at that time, and it's very important to understand why it began with the name of European Economical Community. For a long time, it was only the European Economical Community. It was not the European Union, because the people of Europe, of Western Europe, could not accept the idea of so-called economical cooperation, but they couldn't support the idea of political federation. I mean, people don't really know what economic is about, and that's why that's why European process of unification began with economy, step by step, and when they managed to realize their economical structure, then they began the creation of a real federal political structure, the one we know now after the Maastricht Treaty, the so-called European Union. So it was a project that was built step by step, of course, an basically anti-communist project, basically pro-capitalist project, basically pro-American project, and basically non-democratical project, because from the very beginning it was a structure created so to take decision that the states, the member state, could not take inside their country because of too strong democratical movements there. So the idea of European Union, of European Economical Community, and later European Union, was at its very base an anti-democratic project. And if you look at the text, at the structure we have now, you understand that everything was done so European Union cannot be democratic and give power to what we call the European Commission. But in fact, it's not the European Commission which has the power inside the European Union. It's what is called unofficially the Eurogroup, which is in fact the reunion of the ministers of finance of all member states. And that's the real leadership of European Union. It's the Eurogroup. And it's very important to know that, because people don't know that this group is so important. In fact, we know that more clearly due to Varoufakis. Whatever we think about the political decision that Varoufakis took when Greece was under the pressures of the European Union and the German imperialism, it's another subject. We have to take into account the book Varoufakis wrote after this experience, in which he described what was still up till then unknown. It means that the real leadership in the European Union is the Eurogroup. Nobody knows about it. And this Eurogroup is the real tool manipulating the European Commission in a situation where, of course, the European Parliament has no voice, no power, and no authority anymore. And so that's very important. We have to concentrate our attention on this Eurogroup and how this Eurogroup functions, because it's the real leadership of European Union. All the tension we have inside European Union are mostly concentrated on such institutions like Europarliament, eventually European Commission. But in fact, this is very practical for the so-called Eurocrats or European bureaucrats, because the main target should be the Eurogroup. It means the reunion of the ministers of finance of member states, in which, as we know, the minister of finance of the leading states, the leading imperialist power, are the real deciders, when, of course, a minister of finance from Greece, from Bulgaria, or even from Poland has nothing to say, comparing with the Bundesminister of Finance from Germany, or eventually the ones coming from France, or even Luxembourg, because as a heaven, financial heaven, Luxembourg has a quite strong role inside European Union. Anyway, much more important than Poland or Greece, for example. So I don't know, maybe you have a questions or...
Okay, so my first question is, you said that in the 1950s the communists were against this project. Now I have impression that the European left and also the Communist Party in the Europe, they have the struggle against fascism, and because the radical right, I don't know, Konfederacja in Poland and also the Solidarna Polska in Poland are Eurosceptic. So the left, social democratic left, they are ultra-European. And also, I think, I am not sure, but I think that most of the communist parties, these parties which continue this tradition of communist parties, I think that the Communist Party of France and other like this, they totally support the European integration, the European Union. So when it is change?
Yeah, you are partly right, but of course you have Communist Party rather strong, like the Greek Communist Party and the Portuguese Communist Party, which are still on the line, we must leave European Union. But you are right, for other leftist forces, including some communist parties, the issue of the European Union has changed. For them, they use an argumentation which is supposed to be a compromise between their former anti-EU point of view and the actual situation. I mean, if you look at them, but in fact, if you look at all the parties inside, let's say, left, center, and center right parties all over Europe, now all over Europe, they will defend the idea that the European Union is not functioning very well, that there are a lot of things very bad, and that we have to rebuild the European Union in a more social way and so on, in a more democratical way and so on and so on. So that's their strategy, and that's very efficient in some countries, more efficient in some countries than in other countries, more efficient, as you said, in Poland than in let's say, Czechia, more efficient in let's say, Spain than in Portugal, and so on and so on. But basically, you are right, leftist party resign from the idea we have to leave European Union and to build something completely different. Of course, it is linked with a lot of events which are not only limited to the issue of European Union. It's the evolution of all the left Marxist and communist parties, and the crisis of Marxism for the late 30 years, which is not only in Europe, but can be observed also in other parts of Europe. But the issue of the European Union is, of course, very important. And then we have to understand that the so-called ultranationalist forces, the so-called extreme right forces, which are theoretically against European Union, in fact, they are never really against European Union. As soon as some of these forces enter some government, and we saw that in Greece, we saw that in Italy, we saw that in quite a lot of countries, they change their discourse. So their so-called anti-European discourse is just an electoral argumentation. So to grasp the working class, which is deceived by the left. And of course, the main reason is then not because the extreme right is strong, but the extreme right is strong just because the left is not leftist. And that's the basic reason we have to take into account. Second, if we have this so-called idea to rebuild Europe, to rebuild the European Union, it's a fake. Because if you look at the text of the European Union, everything was made to make impossible a reconstruction of European Union on democratic line, not to take about social line, because every basic decision in the European Union has to be taken with the acceptation of all member states. And you will have always 1, 2, or 10 member states that will not be in favor of this reconstruction at a given moment. And it was done, especially in that direction. European institutions are planned, as one of the European commissioners told, it's like a a highway where you have no exit. He told that like that. It was very sure. European Union is a highway where you have no exit. Just imagine what it means, a highway where you have no exit. You must go in that direction to the end of the human history. And that's very important. You have people like Jacques Attali, which is what was and still is the counselor of all French presidents from Mitterrand up to now, and who is one of the builders of the European text. And he told in one of his intervention that the European institution he was planning with other colleagues were specially created so they couldn't be changed. So we have to understand that if we are really in favor of new relations, let's say, to talk in the Marxist way, real internationalist cooperation in Europe, we must first destroy European Union and create something completely different. That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, we have to think about is why France and Poland, for example, should have stronger relations between them than, let's say, France with Algeria or Poland with Belarus or Russia. That's another thing, because basically the idea of European Union is, I would say, not extremely, but is a racist idea. It means it's a union of state based on what? On the color of skin? On the Christian religion? And of course, you have to know. I mean, who knows that the so-called European flag, the blue flag with 12 stars, is the Holy Virgin Mary flag. And it's an historical fact. I mean, we know now who planned this flag and in what purpose. It was a French Christian Democrat who planned this flag, because for him, of course, the European Union has to be a Christian or even a Catholic union of nations. And not a secularized one, and then, of course, especially not taking inside some, let's say, Muslim countries or non-Christian countries. And that's the reason why, for example, Turkey, I'm not in favor of the belonging of Turkey to European Union for different reasons. But I mean, why Turkey should be out of European Union and why Greece should be in the European Union. The only reason is that one country is Christian and the second one is Muslim. And I think it's in a democratic project, this argumentation shouldn't exist. You have to have political, ideological, eventually economical argumentation, but no religious argumentation, which are of course not pushed ahead, but which are always behind the line. And if you look at the text of the Vatican concerning European Union from European integration from the very beginning, you understand that ideologically the Vatican is the main force promoting the idea of European integration on, of course, it's logical, on religious ground. And of course that there is a change between the time of Hitler and the time of and the nowadays time. But ideologically speaking, I mean the Hitler idea of a new European order is basically based on the same argumentation, exactly the same argumentation that the idea of European Union now. If you look, for example, at the Paris exhibition in 1943, the German organized an exhibition concerning the so-called new European order in Paris. And the argumentation they used at this exhibition, if you look at the archives, were exactly the same words that are used now by European Union leaders. Exactly the same economical argumentations, pseudo-rational argumentation, civilizational argumentation, and so on and so on and so on. And Poles have to understand that under German new European order, they were supposed to be the Generalna Gubernia, the general government, the slaves working for the German masters, of course, the German capitalist masters. And in the new European Union, it's exactly the same. I mean, Poland is a work reservation, reservation for the German capitalist and for the German imperialist. I mean, of course, they do not use now the such words like Untermenschen and so on, but in fact, a Polish worker working for BMW, or I don't know, the German factory in Silesia have the pay a German worker will have. And so the European Union is built to divide proletarians and push them in competition, one against the other. And that's the very base of the European Union. And we have to understand at the left that European Union cannot be rebuilt. If we want a real internationalist cooperation between nations, we have to leave European Union and build something else. And that's the reason why the British working class voted for Brexit. And it's a big tragedy in Britain now when you find the Conservative Party fighting now, and it's official, last conference of the Conservative Party decided that the wages of British workers should be higher because the Brexit makes situation better for working class. And the Labour Party, the so-called left in Britain, it was against Brexit and lost the working class electorate in favor of the Conservative. Now the Conservative Party in Britain is more working class and more socially oriented than the Labour Party. And it's, of course, a tragedy. But if you look at the last conference of the Conservative Party in England last month, the leader of the Conservative Party, the militants of the Conservative Party, were telling such things like, now the British capitalists must understand that they must give higher wages they couldn't under the European Union regime, and we have to promote the working class and so on and so on. Of course, we can say it's demagogy. But if it's demagogy, and anyway, the demagogy of the Conservative Party in England, is much more well seen among workers than the pro-European demagogy of the Labour Party bureaucrats who ruined their party and ruined the British left. And in fact, the fact is that now a British worker earns more money now than a year ago, since the Brexit and because of the Brexit. And that we have to take into account. I mean, if the left do not understand what happened in Britain, it's not the left. I mean, they cannot think about an alternative to capitalism if they don't understand what happened in England.
Okay, I have three questions, but it is one question, so they are combined.
It's the Holy Trinity.
Yes. So first question, you said that European Union was an American project,
Yeah.
not And in the time of Donald Trump, we have a big conflict between European Union and the United States. So I I don't understand if now European Union is all the time American project, or it's finished this collaboration, when it was finished. So maybe this is first things. Second thing, this change in European Union, because Europe is changed all the time. It's in 2004, when there was a referendum in Poland, they proposed the better condition to political condition to Poland in this time, that the
Yeah, yeah, the
Polish.
Nice Treaty.
Yes, yes, the Polish politicians were more represented in Europe than today. And so there are some things which are new there from 50s. For example, that introduced the one currency of euro after creation. So is there, in your opinion, some plan of centralization, making this evolution of European Union towards to one united state? And if so, what will happen in next years, for example, with all this reconstruction plan with money? And last things, many Polish commentators, especially from right perspective, they said that the European Union is German project, that Germany used European Union to spread the influence, and all this unification of Europe, it is building the colonies from Germany, from all this. So from your perspective, what is the role of Germany in this new centralized Europe?
Yeah, also, of course, that the United States were at the base of the European Union after the Second World War, but it doesn't mean that there is no what we called earlier the inter-imperialist contradictions. And of course, at the end of the Second World War, the United States were the leading imperialist power without any question. Now, of course, the situation has evaluated. United States are in crisis, and even if European Union is in crisis, of course, German imperialism, especially German imperialism, but also to a large extent French, British, or even Italian, are also stronger than they were at the end of the Second World War. So there is always a question of balance of power between all those imperialism inside Western structures. Of course, the Trump moment was a very specific moment in the history of the United States because the globalization project, and European Union is part of the globalization project, are not functioning well for all classes of the society. And in United States, I mean, the Trump, whatever we think about Trump, and the Trump electorate is an electorate which was to a large extent under threat of globalization, and we find exactly the same situation in Europe, including Germany. I mean, what is called the AfD in Germany, the right wing in Germany, is the result of the fact that quite a large part of the German society do not fit inside globalization, inside European Union. And of course, if we have a class analysis of the situation, we understand that a lot of lower classes in every imperialist countries cannot support the globalization process and especially the European Union process. The tragedy of this situation is that it is mostly a right-wing so-called populist movement using this argumentation, but when they take power, they do not change quite a lot. So it's a very good for them for electoral reason, but they have no plan of any alternative toward globalization and toward European Union. We could see that in Poland with the Kaczynski regime. And I'm sure that if the Confederacy arrive in Poland, they will not change a lot, because basically they never change a lot, like we saw it in Italy when the Lega Norte, the extreme right movement in Italy arrived in the government. They of course ceased any anti or so-called Eurosceptical argumentation they used earlier. So we have then to take that into account. I mean, extreme right nationalism was always and is, of course, now also a fake that can work like Nazism. I mean, the Nazi managed to have support of quite a strong part of the German society, and extreme right like Trump, like Confederacja in Poland, like Salvini in Italy, and so on, and Le Pen in France, managed to get the support from, let's say, losers of capitalism that are not able to understand scientifically, rationally, how capitalism functions, how globalization functions, and why the only solution for them is a social revolution that will eliminate capitalism. That's the big problem, and that's especially now the big problem, because the left became more and more right-wing when the right have the monopoly in a lot of countries of, let's say, alternative, pseudo-alternative, of course, discourse. When the extreme right in Poland is using the idea that the Germany is taking advantage of the European Union, of course they are partly right. But the problem is that they talk about Germany, they don't talk about German imperialism. And Germany and German imperialism, that can be two different things. I mean, of course, the German state is an imperialist state. It was an imperialist state before the Second World War, during the Second World War. Why would the German capitalists, who were the base of the German imperialism before the war and during the war, would not be imperialist by now? I mean, if you look at the German policies, not only in Europe, but all over the world, now you have very strong intelligence, German intelligence service in Western Africa, in Tunisia. You have very strong activities of the German foundations outside Europe, in Africa, in the Arab world. We have also, of course, the activities of these foundations and intelligence service in Central Eastern Europe. All that means that the German imperialism is functioning in a very tense way, and for sure German imperialism exists. Just that the left do not want anymore to use the word imperialism. Eventually they can still, but they do not really want to use it against United States. But to talk about French imperialism, to talk about German imperialism, is supposed to be out of reality. But of course, there is something like German imperialism. The problem is that the fight against German imperialism must be carried out in such country like Poland on a class base, on a class analysis, and not against the German nation, but against the German imperialist state and against the German capitalist enterprises who are working against or are exploiting people in Poland, but who are exploiting also people in Germany. If you look at the social policy of the German state for the last 10 years after the so-called Hartz agreement between trade unions, state and capitalists, you understand that German nation now, as a society, is for a large part an impoverished nation. Look at the salaries in Germany. I mean, a lot of Germans lost their standard of living during the last 10, 15 years. I mean, the reunification of Germany for the German workers in the East and in the West was a catastrophe. But the German reunification was, of course, something very positive for the German imperialists. So there is, of course, an objective common interest between Polish working class and German working class against German imperialism. Of course, the Polish nationalists will never tell that because, in fact, they're in favor of capitalism. So they talk about against Germany, but they don't talk about against German bourgeoisie. They don't talk about against German capitalism, like they do not talk against Polish capitalism and Polish capitalists, because in fact they are pro-capitalist and they don't want to understand what are class situation and what are economical situation. And it's of course a very good situation for the two main Polish political parties. It means the liberal PO and the, let's say, populist PiS, because they know that if they have only a right-wing opposition, they can divide the Polish political scene between themselves for the future century. Their main fear in Poland, like in everywhere is in Europe, is to see a real alternative leftist, class-oriented, revolutionary left emerging. But such a strong left must, of course, carry on an internationalist policy and anti-imperialist policy, and in the same time, of course, a class policy inside their own countries. And of course, if you look at the role of German parties, of German political foundations, including the so-called radical left foundation, they are all working to dismantle any strong class struggle against local bourgeoisie and against German bourgeoisie.
Okay, so there is two commentaries from the chat, and this is to question. First, I will read some first question, but I will modify this question a little. What's your view on persecution of the communists, bans on communist parties in the eastern part of EU? It's not the case in the western part, and yet EU Parliament launches anti-communist crusade. I mean the motion passed by the European Parliament last month, which equates communists with the monster of fascism. Why don't they have the courage to do the same in case of communist parties in the West EU? And I will modify this question. Do you think that if Poland are not a member of the European Union, the persecution of Polish communists could be more severe or less severe? But I will read a second question also. Some say, Paul Cockshott, for example, that during globalization stage of capitalism, it would be impossible to build socialism in country without large internal market. Production is too decentralized, and cases of Mitterrand government verified this idea. It abandoned moderately socialist program under pressure of the markets, leaving EU and trying to build socialism in relatively small country will result in the end either in failure or in case of success, it would doom population of this country being unable to meet its consumption requirements to live under Spartan condition and resentment towards socialist cause. Reforming EU as a whole seems better long-time strategy than the living EU and condemning ourselves to repeating mistakes of not being able to fulfill consumptional aspiration of working classes.
Okay, so that's all, yeah?
Yes, yes.
Yes, concerning persecution of communists, I would say, first of all, that Eastern Europe, Eastern EU country now, were created after the disappearing of Soviet Union as a laboratorium for Western world and especially for Western Europe. So what they are pushing, they are admitting, and they are pushing a strong anti-social policies, strong anti-communist policies in Baltic states, in Poland, or in other Eastern European countries. So to make this country intervene on the European Union level to push all the European level in the conservative, ultra-conservative, and reactionary way, and that's the whole hypocrisy of Western Europe, because the law you talk about against making equality between Hitlerism and communism was a law adopted by a member of parliament coming from Eastern and Western Europe, including quite a lot of so-called leftist parliamentarians. So, I mean, of course, European Union right wings are the so-called bad guys, bad cop, used to promote the so-called moderate best cop in Western Europe, but they are all functioning in the same ideology, in the same direction. And of course, if anti-communism can be considered as less or are not so strong in Western Europe than in Eastern Europe, it's the case only when the class struggle is not strong. I mean, when you had in France the yellow vest, they put several hundred people in jail. So when you have a real class struggle, Western Europe is not at all more democratic than Eastern Europe, not at all. And you have the same thing in Spain, you have the same thing in Italy, you have political prisoners in Western Europe, not only in Eastern Europe. Of course, repression against communism is not the same in Eastern and Western Europe, because Western communist parties are weak and inefficient, and most of them went on the social democratic line. And social democracy, of course, doesn't bother capitalists. But look at the situation in Greece, look at the situation in Portugal, and then when you will understand that the communists there are not in a very better situation than in Baltic states or in Poland. That's the first point. And you cannot defend a bourgeois institution if you think that this bourgeois institution will defend you on the left. I mean, it's nonsense. I mean, a bourgeois institution will work for bourgeoisie. That's all. So to be out of European Union is not a question that the Western Parliament or the Western democratic liberal will defend you. They don't defend you in Latvia. They don't defend you in Poland. Why they would defend you? What is the difference if they are or not inside European Union? That's the first thing. The second thing I told you already is that the European Union is built so to be impossible to change it. So the idea that you can transform European Union is purely illegal. I mean, you have texts, you have treaties which make the possibility to reform European Union impossible. So it's an impossible dream. I mean, it's impossible. It's on the text. You have to make a revolution if you want to change the text that were adopted by member states, because you have, it's exactly the situation we had in Poland at the end of the 17th century. In the 18th century, you had the liberum veto. Because of one member of the Sejm, it was possible to block the functionment of the whole state. And we have exactly the same situation in the European Union. And it's not by chance. I mean, it was planned. I mean, we have liberum veto inside European Union. I mean, one state says no and everything is blocked. So it's very logical. I mean, the liberal veto system in the former Polish Noble Republic was not a stupid idea. It was a very good idea, because this idea made magnateria, made the highest aristocracy, having the monopoly of power and the monopoly of tools of domination on the economical and political ground. And that's the reason why you had liberum veto. And it's exactly the same thing. You have liberum veto inside European Union for the same basic reason. Of course, it's not the magnateria, it's not the old Polish aristocracy who is leading European Union. It's the new capitalist oligarchy which is leading the European Union. But it's exactly the same. I mean, what did the Poles, the progressive Poles, did at the end of the 18th century? They forced a general change by mobilization of the population and by an uprising. Of course, this uprising was defeated, but it's another question. But the idea was that you have to have a rupture with the former system to create a new one. So it's exactly the same in the European Union. You have to have a complete rupture with of the system if you want to build a new one. So what we have to do first is to work on a new system, what system we would like to have, and then destroy the old one and build a new one. At the European level, at the international level, at the national level, that's all have to be taken into account and under debate. But the question that European Union can be transformed is a pure illusion. It's impossible. There is a structure in the world which is functioning. It's not at all a socialist structure, but it's an economical and diplomatical structure which functions quite well. It's the ASEAN, Southeast Asian Cooperation Organization. Why it functions much better than the European Union? Because it gives to every state sovereignty and tools of negotiations. When there are differences between states, they negotiate, and that's the base of their philosophy. And ASEAN, as an economical, as a social tool, is much more progressive than European Union. But European Union is a reactionary institution, aimed to force the power of a decaying, and I say a decaying bourgeoisie, a decaying imperialist bourgeoisie, in a situation where you have alternative power growing all over the world, and especially in Eastern Asia. And in this situation, European Union is something like a ghetto for oligarchs, like the former Polish Republic was a ghetto for oligarch till the very end. And what happened at the very end? The magnataria who was in favor of the liberum veto went to Petersburg and decided that their new leader will be the Tsar. And then they became partisans of the autocracy, from liberum veto to autocracy. But there is a logic in it, because they knew the Tsar will defend their interests exactly the same way than the liberum veto did inside the Polish so-called Commonwealth. So it's exactly the same with European Union. I mean, for the moment, of course, you have local bourgeoisie defending European Union. You don't know. Tomorrow they can change their allies and look for another protectors. But for the moment, European Union is a ghetto for oligarchs and imperialists, of course.
Okay, and there is another question from chat, and my question from chat is, why isn't there any serious movement of workers now that across European Union capitalists increase the cost of living by enormous inflation, electricity prices, fuel prices, etc.? Why is there no response? And my question, could you say something about what the Western European elites thinking about Poland, about Hungary? Do you think that in this conflict against Poland and Hungary, it is because of values, or it is something like neo-colonial comportment that they don't respect the Eastern European countries, and they don't respect if somebody would try to be a little independent, they want to crush them like they crushed Greece in 2015.
Yes, first question, because I forgot. I noticed the second one.
Why there are no movement against inflation and gas prices and electricity?
I don't. Of course, I'm not able to give a complete answer to that question, because it needs to be analyzed very, very profoundly and in every country. But I would say mostly that the working class are divided, the big centralized industry was delocalized outside Europe, mostly in third world countries, and working people, working classes inside the European Union are fragmented. And that's, of course, a very big problem, how to reunify them and to make them aware that they can lead and they can even win. And this situation arrived in the same time when radical left parties disintegrated. When I say disintegrated, they didn't disappear in most of cases, but they're disintegrated in this sense that the whole tradition of the left revolutionary movement was to have local cells of party inside each enterprise and inside each city districts or village. And this has been disintegrated. And now these parties are mostly electoral parties, but on the everyday life, you don't meet people from leftist party. And if you don't meet people with leftist party, you cannot mobilize. And that's the basic reason. I mean, 95% of European citizens, wherever, in which country they are, they do not have, in the place where they work or in the place where they live, concrete militants who are fighting day by day with them for local issues, social issues, working issues, and so on. You have one very good exception. It's the city of Graz in Austria, the second city in Austria, where the communists did win last election. But if you look why the communists on the very strongly leftist orientation, because the Styrian Federation of the Austrian Communist Party was always very critical against the so-called European Euro left line of the Communist Party of Austria. Styria was so-called Stalinist. And they are still so-called Stalinists inside that Communist Party. But they managed to win the last election. Why they managed to win the last election? Because for the last 30 years, they are on the ground in every osiedle. I don't know in English how you call that, but in Polish, osiedle.
Neighborhood? No.
In every, you have a group of communists. In every enterprise, you have a group of communists. And these communists, they fight every day for local problems, for everyday life problems of people, social problems, family problems, working problems, and so on. So day by day, they built something which unified people who understood that being or not being communist, the communists will be on their side. And that's the reason why the city of Graz is a very good example. The communists of Graz did what I experienced in France 30 years ago. I mean, 30 years ago, you had communists everywhere in France. You went down from your house and you had communist militants talking to you, asking you what was the situation, how to help to fight, and so on. And you were going inside your enterprise. I was, for example, at Paris airport. At Paris airport, you had a group of communists analyzing the policy of Paris airport authority on the social ground, on the human ground, and they were every day there. And of course, at that time, Communist Party had 20% of the vote. And the trade unions were under communist influence. And people who were not communist, and even people who were anti-communist, when they had a social problem, they went on the local cell of the Communist Party asking for help. If you don't have that, you will never have a new left in Europe. I mean, how the Indian trade union managed to create the 250 million striking people last year in India? Just because of that, because they go from village to village, day by day, and at the very end, 10 years later, 20 years later, they have a relation with everyday life people, and people know they will fight for them. And people identify with them, and they know that these people are on their side and are doing. Most of leftist militants now in Europe, you know, they want election, they want to be MP, they want to be local councillor, city councillor, they want to discuss about politics, but they don't fight for everyday working class. And that's why you had the yellow vest in France, because a lot of people in France are against the regime, but they have no organization, so they created the grassroots movement. And that's the situation. Concerning now the Poland and EU relation, I think that for the moment, it's not a question of Polexit, as they told as they some tell in Poland. It's just a question of balance of power. Britain went out from European Union, so there is a place to take. I mean, of course, there is in such an institution as European Union, every state and every state bureaucracy, of course, had some influence. The British left, and the British, of course, had very strong influence. So there is a vacuum. And in this vacuum, it's of course very logical if you look at the Polish map, at the European, at the map. If you look at the demography, you understand that Kaczynski is telling, oh, the British went out with 60 million people, 250,000 kilometers, and Poland has almost 40 million, 300,000 kilometers. Poland can take the place of Britain inside European institutions. And we will not be the little ones as we were before. We will be a new Britain inside a European Union, or a little Britain at least. And that's of course what he wants to do, and it's very logical. I mean, Poland can take objectively much more influence now than at the British time, and Poland can manage to do it, developing a relation with other members of European Union that feel a little bit, let's say, diminished, like Hungary and like other Eastern European countries. And the idea that Poland can be a little power inside European Union is logical. Still, and that's the basic situation, it will not change quite a lot because, as I told you, political institutions inside the European Union are secondary. And the main question is not to have more to say inside the European Commission. The main issue is to know what will be your real influence inside the Eurogroup. It means if your finance minister is able to take the place of the British finance minister. And that I doubt, because of course the Polish finance minister has not behind him the city of London. And he has not the mean of pressure the British Minister of Finance had inside the Eurogroup. So yeah, I think it's quite an illusion for the Kaczynski and that's the problem of the Polish so-called political class. They do not understand what is capitalism. They do not understand that the real power in capitalism is not politics, but economics. And that as long as you do not have a Polish capitalism, and you will never have it, you will never have political power. Because a Polish capitalism will never happen because German imperialism does not want to have a Polish capitalism. He can have some petty capitalists working for him, for German imperialists, but they will never accept a Polish, let's say, multinational capitalist enterprise to appear on the European market. It's impossible. I mean, they eliminated any competitors in Western Europe, so why they would not do the same in Eastern Europe, where it's much more easier.
Okay, thank you, Bruno, for all these things. I would like to finish now because we will continue our discussion with Bruno in Polish language in 5 minutes, or maybe later. We will talk about the Eric Zemmour, difference between Eric Zemmour, Marine Le Pen, and the situation in the French politics, in the right scene. So See you in odrodzenie komunizmu.
Okay.